A 5-year-old girl wanders into the middle of a billionaire's high-stakes boardroom, points a trembling finger at the ruthless, notoriously cold CEO, and says the one word that brings a multi-million-dollar empire to a grinding halt: "Mommy." What happens next isn't a childish misunderstanding. It's the unraveling of a deeply buried secret that took 5 years, a tragic death, and a desperate father to uncover. By the time this single dad finishes his explanation, the most powerful woman in the city is left entirely speechless. You won't believe how their pasts collide. The Zenith Tower in downtown Chicago was less of an office building and more of a monument to Claire Montgomery's sheer will. At 34, Claire was the founder and CEO of Montgomery Global, a real estate and tech conglomerate that had swallowed its competitors whole. She was famously known in the financial press as the Ice Queen, a woman with an impeccably tailored wardrobe, razor-sharp cheekbones, and a heart allegedly made of the same cold, tinted glass that wrapped her penthouse boardroom. She did not tolerate incompetence. She despised emotional pleas, and above all, she absolutely forbade children in her professional domain. Andrew Hayes knew this. He had spent the last 3 weeks researching every article, every interview, and every ruthless business move Claire Montgomery had ever made. At 35, Andrew was a wildly talented but financially drowning landscape architect. He was an independent contractor running a struggling firm that he had built from the ground up after the devastating loss of his wife, Hannah, 3 years prior. Winning the bid to design the green spaces for Montgomery Global's new eco-campus wasn't just a career milestone for Andrew. It was a matter of survival. It was the difference between keeping his small house in the suburbs and having to sell it to pay off the crushing medical debts Hannah had left behind. He had everything perfectly planned for the Tuesday morning pitch. His blueprints were flawless, his financial projections were airtight, and his presentation was rehearsed to the second. But life as a single father was an unpredictable beast. At 6:30 a.m., his elderly babysitter, Mrs. Gable, had been rushed to the hospital with a minor stroke. With no family in the city, no backup childcare, and zero chance of rescheduling a meeting with Claire Montgomery without losing the bid entirely, Andrew had been forced into a desperate corner, which was why a 5-year-old girl in a bright yellow raincoat and matching rain boots was currently sitting in the corner of the most intimidating boardroom in the Midwest. "Daddy, my red crayon is broken," Chloe whispered, her big, round eyes looking up at him from the massive leather chair that practically swallowed her small frame. She had a mop of unruly, dark chestnut curls that fell over her forehead, and a seriousness to her face that always made Andrew's heart ache. "I know, sweetie. Just use the blue one for now, okay?" Andrew whispered back, frantically adjusting the collar of his suit, which suddenly felt 3 sizes too tight. "And remember our deal, quiet as a mouse while Daddy talks to the important people." Chloe nodded solemnly, returning her attention to her coloring book. She was a deeply empathetic child, possessing a quiet intuition that felt far older than her 5 years. At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy oak doors swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Claire Montgomery walked in, flanked by 4 senior executives who trailed behind her like nervous shadows. Claire was a striking woman, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, flawless twist, her piercing green eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk locking onto its prey. Andrew immediately stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Ms. Montgomery, thank you for taking the time." Claire didn't even look at him. Her gaze had stopped dead on the corner of the room. The senior executives froze, their eyes following their boss's line of sight. Chloe was sitting cross-legged in the oversized chair, humming softly, a blue crayon clutched in her small hand. "Mr. Hayes." Claire's voice was smooth, quiet, and terrifyingly cold. I was under the impression we were reviewing a multi-million-dollar architectural bid. I was unaware this was a daycare center. Andrew felt the blood drain from his face. Ms. Montgomery, I can only apologize. My childcare provider had a severe medical emergency this morning. I had absolutely no other option but to bring my daughter, Chloe. I assure you, she is completely quiet and will not disrupt. I don't do children in the boardroom, Mr. Hayes. It demonstrates a profound lack of boundaries and professionalism. Claire interrupted, finally turning her sharp green eyes toward him. If you cannot manage your personal life, how do you expect to manage a project of this magnitude? The dismissal was implicit. Andrew felt the crushing weight of failure bearing down on him. He had lost. Before he could even unroll a blueprint, he had lost the future he was trying to build for his little girl. Please, Andrew said, his voice dropping its corporate polish, replaced by raw, desperate honesty. Give me 10 minutes. If my designs don't blow you away, I will pack up my daughter and leave, and you will never see me again. But don't punish my firm for a father trying to keep his family afloat. Claire stared at him. The silence in the room was deafening. She looked back at the little girl. At that exact moment, Chloe, oblivious to the immense corporate tension, shifted in her seat. The blue crayon slipped from her fingers, hit the polished mahogany table, and rolled off the edge. It bounced on the thick carpet and rolled directly until it hit the toe of Claire Montgomery's black designer heel. Everyone in the room stopped breathing. One of the executives actually took a half-step backward. Chloe hopped down from the massive chair. Her little yellow rain boots squeaked softly against the floor as she walked right up to the most feared CEO in Chicago. Chloe, no, come back here, Andrew hissed, his heart leaping into his throat. But Chloe didn't look at her father. She stood in front of Claire, looking down at the crayon, and then slowly tilted her head back to look up at the towering woman. Claire looked down at the little girl. For the first time in a decade, the Ice Queen's carefully constructed mask faltered. Claire's breath hitched. She stared into the little girl's bright, piercing green eyes. She looked at the unruly dark chestnut curls. She saw the slope of the girl's nose, the exact shape of her jaw. Chloe's eyes widened. Her small lips parted in awe. The fear that usually accompanied stress vanished from the little girl's face, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming wave of recognition. Chloe reached down, picked up the crayon, and then, looking directly into Claire Montgomery's stunned green eyes, she smiled, a radiant, heartbreaking smile. "Mommy," Chloe whispered. The word echoed in the cavernous boardroom like a gunshot. For a solid 10 seconds, nobody moved. The boardroom of Montgomery Global, usually a theater of loud negotiations and aggressive power plays, descended into a paralyzed, suffocating silence. Andrew felt as though the floor had vanished beneath him. A cold sweat broke out across his shoulders. He practically lunged across the room, wrapping his arms around Chloe and pulling her back against his chest. "I am so sorry," Andrew stammered, his voice shaking as he pulled Chloe away from the CEO. She's just confused. Her mother passed away when she was 2. She doesn't know what she's saying. I'm so incredibly sorry. Ms. Montgomery. But Claire didn't respond to him. She didn't snap at him to leave. She didn't make a sarcastic remark about his unprofessionalism. Instead, she stood frozen, her perfectly manicured hands trembling ever so slightly at her sides. All the color had drained from her face, leaving her pale and visibly shaken. She was staring at the little girl, her green eyes locked onto Chloe's with a terrifying intensity. "Mommy, it's her," Chloe whispered, pointing a small finger at Claire from the safety of Andrew's arms. "She came out of the picture." "Hush, Chloe, please," Andrew pleaded, feeling a rising tide of panic. He looked at the executives, who were exchanging bewildered, uncomfortable glances. "I'll pack up my things. I apologize for wasting your time." "No." The word cracked through the air. It was Claire. She finally tore her eyes away from the little girl and looked at Andrew. The coldness in her gaze had been replaced by something erratic, something frantic that Andrew couldn't quite read. "Everyone out," Claire commanded, her voice regaining its sharp edge, though it shook slightly. "Ms. Montgomery, the quarterly review," one of the executives started. "I said out," Claire snapped, slamming a hand down on the mahogany table. The executives scrambled, gathering their tablets and files, rushing out of the glass doors like frightened cattle. Within seconds, it was just Claire, Andrew, and little Chloe in the massive room. "Put her down," Claire said softly, her eyes drifting back to the little girl. Andrew tightened his grip. "Ms. Montgomery, I don't know what kind of game you think this is, but my daughter is off limits. I made a mistake bringing her here, and I'm leaving. Mr. Hayes, if you walk out that door, you will never work in this city again. I will personally see to it," Claire said, the threat entirely devoid of malice. It was simply a statement of fact. "Put the child down. Let her go back to her coloring. We are going to sit at this table, and you are going to tell me exactly what kind of sick, manipulative stunt you are trying to pull." Andrew slowly lowered Chloe to the floor. "Go finish your picture. Bug," he whispered, kissing the top of her head. Chloe nodded, casting one more, long, lingering look at Claire, before walking back to her leather chair. Andrew walked to the table and sat opposite the billionaire. He didn't shrink away this time. His protective instincts had overridden his corporate anxiety. "It's not a stunt," Andrew said firmly, meeting her fierce gaze. "It was an honest mistake." She saw a resemblance. Children have active imaginations. "A resemblance," Claire scoffed, though the bravado was thin. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her eyes drilling into Andrew. "Mr. Hayes, I am not an idiot. I have dealt with corporate espionage, blackmail, and extortion from men much smarter than you. That child. She has my exact eye color, not just green, hazel green with a brown fleck in the left iris. She has my jawline. She has the exact curl pattern of my hair before I started having it chemically straightened 20 years ago. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Who sent you? Did a rival firm dig up a picture of me as a child and hire you to parade this girl in here to rattle me?" Andrew stared at her, genuinely appalled. "Are you insane? You think I genetically engineered my 5-year-old daughter, who I've raised since she was a newborn, to look like a woman I've never met, just to get a landscaping contract?" Claire opened her mouth, then closed it. The logical impossibility of her accusation hung heavily in the air. She looked back at Chloe, who was now quietly coloring a tree, completely unbothered by the heavy atmosphere. "So then explain it," Claire demanded, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Why did she call me mommy?" "Because she's a grieving little girl who wants a mother." Andrew lied. It was a smooth lie, a necessary lie. The real truth was far too dangerous, far too complicated, and far too fragile to expose to a ruthless CEO who viewed human connection as a liability. "She sees beautiful women on television or in magazines, and she projects, 'You're a beautiful woman, Ms. Montgomery. You wore a suit.' She was intimidated, her brain short-circuited. That's it. It's psychology, not a conspiracy." Claire stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. She was searching his face for a tell, a crack in his armor. Finally, she leaned back, Leave your portfolio on the desk. Take your daughter and go home. Mr. Hayes, I will review your bid. Andrew didn't need to be told twice. He gathered his blueprints, scooped Chloe up into his arms, and fled the Zenith Tower as if the building were on fire. But Claire Montgomery did not review the bid that day. Instead, she canceled her remaining meetings, went back to her penthouse apartment, and poured herself a stiff drink. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, but she wasn't seeing the water. She was seeing those green eyes. She was hearing that tiny, fragile voice calling her Mommy. Claire had never wanted children. She had clawed her way out of a poverty-stricken childhood in South Boston, swearing she would never be vulnerable, never be dependent, and never be tied down. She had sacrificed everything, relationships, friendships, peace of mind, to build her empire. She was fundamentally alone, and she had always convinced herself that she preferred it that way. But that little girl had shattered something inside her. Claire walked over to her desk and picked up her phone. She dialed a number she only used for extreme corporate emergencies. "Richard," Claire said as soon as the line connected. "I need a full invasive background check on a man named Andrew Hayes. He runs a local landscape architecture firm. I need everything. Financials, medical history, marital status. I especially need to know everything about his late wife and his daughter, Chloe." "How deep do you want me to dig?" "Claire," the gruff voice of her private investigator asked. "To the bone," Claire replied. "I want to know what he ate for breakfast 5 years ago. I want the file on my desk by tomorrow morning." The next 24 hours were agonizing for Claire. She couldn't focus. During a board meeting, she found herself staring at the empty leather chair where Chloe had been sitting. At 8 a.m. the following day, a thick manila folder was sitting on her mahogany desk. Claire locked her office door, sat down, and opened the file. Andrew Hayes was exactly what he appeared to be. A hard-working, struggling single father. His late wife, Hannah, had died of aggressive ovarian cancer when Chloe was 2. Claire flipped to a photograph of Hannah. She paused. Hannah Hayes was a beautiful woman, but she was blonde, blue-eyed, and petite. She looked absolutely nothing like Chloe. Claire flipped back to Andrew's photo. Dark hair, but straight. Brown eyes. Genetically, Chloe made no sense as the biological offspring of Andrew and Hannah Hayes. Claire's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She flipped to the next page. It was a summary of Andrew and Hannah's medical history, illegally obtained by Richard's vast network. 2020. Hannah Hayes diagnosed with premature ovarian failure. Infertility treatments unsuccessful. 2021. Couple seeks treatment at Oakwood Fertility Center, Boston, Massachusetts. October 2021. Successful IVF implantation using donor egg and husband's sperm. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The paper slipped from her trembling fingers. Oakwood Fertility Center, Boston, 2021. Suddenly, the cold, impenetrable walls of Claire's empire felt like they were closing in on her. The memories she had suppressed for 6 years came rushing back with violent force. She remembered the sterile white walls of the clinic. She remembered the desperate, crushing poverty of her mid-20s, trying to secure seed funding for her first software prototype. Banks had laughed at her. Investors had dismissed her. She had been weeks away from eviction. So, she had done the only thing she could. She had sold her eggs to an elite, highly discreet fertility clinic that paid a premium for donors with exceptional IQs and perfect health records. Donor 414. It had given her the $50,000 she needed to launch Montgomery Tech. She had signed ironclad anonymity agreements. walked out of the clinic, and never looked back. It was a transaction, nothing more. Until yesterday. Until a little girl in a yellow raincoat looked at her and said the one word Claire had sold the right to hear. She picked up the phone. Her voice was uncharacteristically unsteady. "Send Andrew Hayes to my private office immediately. Tell him his contract depends on it." When Andrew arrived at the Zenith Tower 2 hours later, he had not brought Chloe. He had managed to secure a backup sitter, dropping half his weekly grocery budget to do so. He stepped off the private elevator onto the top floor, his stomach tied in agonizing knots. He expected to walk into the boardroom again, to be surrounded by executives and rejected publicly. Instead, Claire's assistant ushered him into Claire's private inner sanctum. It was a stunning, modern room, but unlike the rest of the building, it felt intimately isolated. Claire was standing by the window, her back to him. "Ms. Montgomery," Andrew said cautiously, gripping his briefcase. "I was told you wanted to see me regarding the eco-campus bid." Claire turned around. She wasn't wearing her signature-tailored blazer. She wore a simple silk blouse, and she looked exhausted. The Ice Queen mask was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, fragile vulnerability that unnerved Andrew more than her anger ever could. She walked over to her desk, picked up the thick manila folder, and tossed it onto the glass coffee table between them. "I had you investigated," Claire said, her voice quiet but echoing heavily in the silent room. Andrew's jaw tightened. Anger flared in his chest, hot and immediate. "You had me investigate because my 5-year-old daughter made a mistake. What is wrong with you? Do you have so much money and power that you think you can just violate people's privacy? Because you felt uncomfortable for 5 minutes." "She didn't make a mistake." "Andrew," Claire said softly. Andrew froze. The anger died in his throat, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. He looked at the file on the table, then back up at Claire. Who is she?" "Andrew." Claire took a step toward him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The ruthless CEO was completely gone. Standing in front of him was a woman desperately seeking an anchor in a sudden, violent storm. Hannah wasn't her biological mother, and unless genetics have decided to pull a miraculous, impossible trick. "Chloe is mine, isn't she?" Andrew stared at her. The secret he had guarded with his life. The secret he thought was buried under layers of legal documents and clinic confidentiality was sitting open on a glass table. He felt a crushing weight settle onto his chest. He slumped into one of the armchairs, burying his face in his hands. "How did you find out?" Andrew whispered, his voice cracking. "Oakwood Fertility Clinic, Boston, 2021, Claire recited, her voice trembling. "I was donor 414. I did it to fund my first company. It was supposed to be completely anonymous, a closed file. I signed away all rights, and I was assured the recipients would never know my identity. So tell me, Andrew, if it was a closed file, and I was just an anonymous donor, why did your daughter call me Mommy?" Andrew slowly lifted his head. He looked at the powerful billionaire, seeing the profound, aching confusion in her eyes. "Because a year ago, I had to break every privacy law in the state of Massachusetts to save her life," Andrew said heavily. Claire's breath hitched. "Save her life? What are you talking about?" Andrew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "When Chloe was 4, she started bruising easily. Then came the fevers. The doctors diagnosed her with a rare, highly aggressive bone marrow deficiency. Hannah was already gone. I was terrified. They told me they needed a bone marrow match immediately, but my blood type wasn't compatible, and she had no siblings." Claire slowly sank into the armchair opposite him, her eyes wide, hanging onto every word. The National Registry was a dead end. Andrew continued, his voice thick with emotion. I knew we used a donor egg. I knew Chloe's biological mother was out there somewhere. So I hired a hacker. I drained my savings, remortgaged the house, and paid a guy on the dark web to breach Oakwood's encrypted servers. I didn't care about the laws. I didn't care about your anonymity. I just wanted to save my little girl. You found my file, Claire whispered. I found your name. Andrew confirmed. Claire Montgomery. I found your medical history, your blood type, and your profile picture from when you were 24. I was preparing to come to Chicago. I was going to stand outside your building and beg you on my hands and knees to get tested for a marrow donation. Why didn't you? Claire asked, a tear finally spilling over her lashes, tracing a line down her sharp cheekbone. Andrew, why didn't you come to me? I would have done it. My God, I would have done it in a heartbeat. I didn't have to. Andrew smiled sadly. 3 days before my flight to Chicago, the hospital called. They found a 10-10 match on the National Registry, a college student in Oregon. He saved her life. The crisis passed. Chloe got her transplant. She recovered, and she's perfectly healthy now. Claire let out a shaky, shuddering breath, burying her face in her hands. The sheer terror of what almost happened to a child she hadn't known existed, just minutes prior, was overwhelming her. But that doesn't explain the boardroom, Claire said, wiping her eyes, trying to regain her composure. If you never contacted me, how did she recognize me? How did she know? Andrew looked down at his calloused hands. When Chloe was sick, she was terrified of the hospital. She cried for her mother constantly. Hannah had told her before she died that if she ever felt lonely, she should look for the other angel who helped bring her into the world. It was just a story to comfort her. But when Chloe was in that hospital bed, I was desperate to give her hope. Andrew looked up, meeting Claire's eyes. I had printed out the file the hacker got me. I had that picture of you. When Chloe was crying, I showed it to her. I told her, this is the woman who gave us the magic to make you. She's strong, and she's fighting for you, too. I kept that picture on her nightstand through her whole recovery. Claire was entirely speechless. The walls of her corporate fortress felt completely meaningless now. All the billions, the properties, the power. It all paled in comparison to the image of a sick little girl holding a printed photograph of her face for comfort. Why, when I started preparing for this pitch, Andrew said softly, I had Forbes magazines on my desk with you on the cover. Chloe saw them. She recognized you immediately. To a 5-year-old brain, the woman in the picture who gave her life is Mommy. I told her you were a very important lady in Chicago. I never, ever planned on bringing her here. But when she saw you in that boardroom, she didn't see the CEO of Montgomery Global. She saw the woman she prayed to when she was sick. Claire sat in absolute silence. The silence stretched for minutes. The Ice Queen, the woman who could negotiate multi-billion-dollar mergers without blinking, who commanded boardrooms with an iron fist, was fundamentally broken open by the quiet, devastating truth of a single father. She looked at Andrew, the man who had fought through hell to protect a child that carried her DNA. She has my eyes, Claire finally whispered, her voice breaking completely. She has your eyes, Andrew agreed softly. And your stubbornness. And apparently, your inability to follow instructions in a boardroom. A small, watery laugh escaped Claire's lips. She looked at the file on the table, then up at Andrew. The world had shifted on its axis. Nothing would ever be the same again. Andrew, Claire said, her voice gaining a new, fragile kind of strength. "I don't know how to be a mother. I don't know how to do any of this. But I know that I cannot let her go. Not again." The transition from billionaire CEO to an active participant in a 5-year-old's life was neither smooth nor graceful. Claire Montgomery attacked motherhood the same way she attacked a hostile corporate takeover, with overwhelming resources, zero hesitation, and a complete disregard for traditional boundaries. On a rainy Saturday afternoon, just 4 days after the revelation, in her penthouse office, a sleek, jet-black Bentley pulled into the cracked, uneven driveway of Andrew Hayes's modest 3-bedroom suburban home. Andrew was in the kitchen, wrestling with a stubborn jar of peanut butter. When the doorbell rang, Chloe, wearing her favorite, mismatched socks, sprinted down the hallway. "I'll get it, Daddy." Andrew wiped his hands on a dish towel and followed her, stopping dead in his tracks as the front door swung open. Claire stood on the porch. She was dressed down, which, for Claire, meant a $3,000 cashmere sweater, designer jeans, and boots that cost more than Andrew's monthly mortgage. Behind her, her massive, broad-shouldered driver was wrestling an enormous, custom-built, 6-foot-tall wooden dollhouse out of the trunk of the Bentley. It had working solar panels on its miniature roof and functioning LED chandeliers. "Mommy!" Chloe shrieked, launching herself forward. Claire stiffened for a fraction of a second before dropping to her knees on the damp porch, catching the little girl in her arms. She buried her face in Chloe's unruly curls, closing her eyes as a visible shudder of relief washed over her. "Hello, Chloe," Claire whispered, her voice thick with an emotion Andrew had never heard from her before. Andrew leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Claire, what is that?" he asked, nodding toward the monstrosity the driver was currently dragging up the walkway. "It's a Victorian replica," Claire said, standing up and smoothing her sweater, instantly regaining a fraction of her corporate composure. "I had it commissioned on Thursday. The interior designer ensured all the paint is non-toxic, and the miniature library is stocked with scale model classic literature." Andrew sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Claire, my living room is 12 by 15 feet. That thing is the size of a refrigerator. And she's 5. She plays with cardboard boxes and a stuffed dinosaur named Reginald." "Nonsense. She deserves the best," Claire replied briskly, motioning for her driver to bring it inside. Over the next 3 weeks, this became the terrifying new normal. The collision of their two worlds was jarring. Claire would leave high-stakes negotiations involving international shipping conglomerates just to attend Chloe's Tuesday afternoon ballet recitals, sitting in the cramped, folding metal chairs of the community center while aggressively typing on 2 different cell phones. She brought in a Michelin-starred private chef to cook Tuesday night dinners at Andrew's house, much to Andrew's irritation, who argued that Chloe needed to learn how to eat regular macaroni and cheese without turning her nose up at it. Yet, beneath the extravagant or misguided gestures, Andrew saw the raw, terrifying vulnerability in the Ice Queen. He saw the way Claire's hands trembled when she braided Chloe's hair. He saw the sheer panic in her eyes when Chloe got a minor scrape on her knee at the park. Claire didn't know how to love someone without trying to buy their safety. But she was trying. And slowly, despite his fierce independence, Andrew found himself looking forward to the sound of the Bentley pulling into his driveway. But a billionaire cannot simply alter her entire life without the predators in the water taking notice. Arthur Pendleton, the ruthless, 60-year-old CEO of Vanguard Holdings, had been waiting for a crack in Claire Montgomery's armor for 5 years. Vanguard was Montgomery Global's biggest rival in the commercial real estate sector, and Arthur despised Claire. He hated her youth, he hated her gender, and most of all, He hated that she consistently outmaneuvered him. Sitting in his mahogany-paneled office, across the city, Arthur reviewed the dossier his own private investigators had just handed him. "So, the Ice Queen is playing house in the suburbs," Arthur murmured, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses as he looked at a covert photograph of Claire, pushing a little girl on a park swing, while a man in a flannel shirt stood beside her, laughing. "The man is Andrew Hayes, a local landscape architect," his lead investigator said. "He recently bid on the Montgomery Eco-Campus. But here is the interesting part, sir. The child is his, but she bears a striking resemblance to Ms. Montgomery. We dug into Hayes's past. His late wife underwent IVF with a donor egg in Boston, right around the time Claire Montgomery was a struggling startup founder in the same city." Arthur's cold, reptilian eyes lit up with malicious glee. "A secret love child? No. Worse. A donor child she's suddenly obsessing over. And Hayes, he's a nobody, a contractor drowning in debt." "There's more," the investigator said, leaning forward. "To find Montgomery, Hayes hired a hacker to breach the Boston Medical Registry. It's a massive federal crime, HIPAA violations, cyber crimes. If that gets out, Hayes goes to federal prison for a decade, and the child goes into the system." Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Claire Montgomery had finally given him a lever long enough to move her empire. "It's time to show Ms. Montgomery the cost of having a heart," Arthur said. "Target the architect, break his business, squeeze him until he suffocates, and then we'll let Claire know exactly who is tightening the noose." The destruction of Andrew Hayes's life was quiet, surgical, and utterly devastating. It started on a Tuesday morning. Andrew was standing on the dirt lot of his largest ongoing project, a community park on the south side of Chicago. It was the job keeping his firm afloat while he waited for the Montgomery Global contract to be finalized. His phone rang. It was his lead supplier for the specialized retaining wall stone he needed. "Andrew, I'm sorry, man," the supplier said, sounding deeply uncomfortable. "We have to pull your order. I can't deliver the stone." "What? Bob, we signed the contract 3 months ago. I've already paid the deposit. I have crews standing around waiting to build," Andrew argued, his stomach dropping. "I'm refunding the deposit. A massive commercial developer just bought out our entire quarry's supply for the next 2 years. They paid triple the market rate and stipulated that all existing contracts be terminated. I can't say no to that kind of money. I'm sorry." The line went dead. 2 hours later, the city planning office called. His permits for the park's water features had been suddenly revoked due to an anonymous tip about environmental code violations. By 3 p.m., his bank called to inform him that his small business credit line, which he relied on to make payroll, had been inexplicably frozen pending an internal risk assessment. In a single 8-hour workday, Andrew's business was effectively destroyed. He drove home in a daze, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. He had survived Hannah's death. He had survived Chloe's cancer. He had clawed his way out of the darkness, time and time again. But this felt different. This felt coordinated. When he pulled into his driveway, the sleek black Bentley was already there. Andrew walked into his house to the sound of laughter. Claire was sitting on the living room floor, her expensive blazer tossed over a chair, helping Chloe build a massive Lego castle. "Daddy, look, we built a moat!" Chloe cheered. Andrew looked at Claire. The billionaire smiled at him, a genuine, warm smile that would have made his heart flutter just a day ago. Today, it made him feel sick. "Chloe, Bug, go to your room for a little bit. Daddy needs to talk to Claire," Andrew said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Chloe, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, nodded quickly and scurried down the hall. Claire stood up, brushing off her jeans, her smile fading as she took in Andrew's pale, exhausted face. "Andrew? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "My business is gone, Claire," Andrew said flatly. "In 8 hours. My suppliers dropped me. My permits were revoked, and my credit line was frozen. Someone with a massive amount of capital just systematically nuked my life." Claire's eyes widened. Her corporate instincts instantly overrode her domestic softness. Her mind raced, connecting the dots faster than a supercomputer. "Vanguard," she whispered. "What?" "Arthur Pendleton. Vanguard Holdings," Claire said, pacing the small living room, her eyes flashing with a sudden, violent rage. "He's my biggest rival. He must have found out about you, about Chloe. He knows he can't touch me directly, so he's attacking my vulnerabilities. He's attacking you to get to me." Andrew stared at her, the reality of her words sinking in like lead weights. "He found out. How? Are you being followed? Are we being watched?" "Andrew, I am a billionaire CEO. I am always being watched." Claire snapped, reaching for her phone. "I will fix this. I'll buy the quarry. I'll call the mayor and have your permits reinstated. I will bury Arthur Pendleton so deep." "Stop!" Andrew shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. Claire froze, staring at him. "I don't want you to buy the quarry, Claire. I don't want your money fixing the mess that your world brought to my doorstep," Andrew said, his voice trembling with anger and fear. "I am a single father. My entire life revolves around keeping Chloe safe, stable, and secure. And in 3 weeks, you have brought corporate espionage, billionaire rivals, and God knows what else into my living room. Andrew, please," Claire pleaded, taking a step toward him. "I didn't want this. I am trying to protect you. By making us targets." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, his breathing heavy. "I broke federal laws to find you. Claire, if a man like Pendleton starts digging, and he finds out I hired a hacker to breach a medical database, I go to prison. Chloe goes to foster care. I lose my daughter." Claire went entirely still. The color drained from her face as the full, horrifying reality of Andrew's vulnerability hit her. She had a team of 50 lawyers. Andrew had nothing. "I love that you care for her." "I do," Andrew said, his voice breaking. "But your world is toxic, Claire. It is dangerous, and I will not let my daughter be collateral damage in a boardroom war." He pointed to the door. "You need to leave." "Andrew, don't do this," Claire whispered, a tear finally escaping her eye. "Don't take her away from me. I'll step down. I'll walk away from the company." "No, you won't. Montgomery Global is your child too, Claire. It's all you've known," Andrew said sadly. "Go fix your mess. Protect us from Pendleton. But until you can guarantee that my daughter is safe from your enemies, I can't have you here." Claire looked at him for a long, heart-breaking moment. She wanted to fight, to argue, to deploy her wealth. But looking at the terrified father in front of her, she knew he was right. She picked up her blazer. "I will fix this," Claire said, her voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper. "I promise you, Andrew, Arthur Pendleton will wish he had never been born." She walked out the door, the Ice Queen returning, colder and more dangerous than ever before. 48 hours later, the storm broke. Arthur Pendleton had not just attacked Andrew. He had maneuvered in the shadows to call an emergency meeting of the Montgomery Global Board of Directors. Using his shell companies, Arthur had quietly purchased a significant block of voting shares over the last year. waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The glass boardroom at the Zenith Tower was packed. The air was thick with tension. Arthur Pendleton sat at the far end of the mahogany table, looking incredibly smug, surrounded by board members he had either bought or intimidated. Claire stood at the head of the table. She wore a striking, crimson-red suit. She did not look like a woman on the verge of losing her empire. She looked like an executioner. "Let's skip the corporate theater. Arthur," Claire said smoothly, resting her hands on the table. "You called this emergency vote to oust me as CEO, citing erratic behavior, dereliction of duty, and misappropriation of company focus. The board has a right to be concerned, Claire," Arthur said with a faux sympathetic smile. "You've cancelled vital meetings. You're bleeding capital into ridiculous suburban vanity projects. And there are rumors, unsavory rumors about a child, about federal crimes committed by your new associate, Mr. Hayes. To locate you, I hold a dossier in my briefcase that, if handed to the federal prosecutor, would ruin you and put your little landscape architect behind bars for a decade." The board members murmured nervously. "So, here is the deal, Claire," Arthur continued, leaning forward. "You step down immediately. You sign over your voting rights to me, allowing Vanguard to merge with Montgomery. In exchange, the dossier goes in the shredder. You get to play mommy in the suburbs, and Mr. Hayes stays out of prison. Checkmate." Claire didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, predatory smile crept across her face. "Arthur, you are a dinosaur," Claire said softly. "You play checkers while I play global thermonomics. Did you really think I spent the last 48 hours crying in my penthouse?" Claire pressed a button on the table. The massive screens on the boardroom walls flickered to life. It was the morning broadcast of the city's largest news network. The headline, scrolling across the bottom, read, "Montgomery CEO donates $50 million to pediatric cancer research in honor of miracle reunion with donor daughter." Arthur's smile vanished. "What did you do?" "I leaked it myself," Claire said, her voice echoing with absolute authority. "I sat down with Diane Sawyer last night for an exclusive interview. I told the world the whole story. I told them about a brave single father who hacked a database out of sheer desperation to save his dying daughter's life. I framed him as a hero. I framed the hacking as a moral imperative that exposed flaws in the medical system, which Montgomery Tech is now offering to fix for free." Claire walked slowly down the length of the table, toward Arthur. "The public loves a miracle. Arthur, the PR is the greatest Montgomery Global has ever seen. The governor called me this morning, crying. Do you really think a federal prosecutor is going to touch Andrew Hayes now? He'd be committing political suicide to arrest a grieving father who just wanted to save his little girl." Arthur's face turned an ugly shade of purple. "You insane bitch! You exposed your own secrets!" "I took away your leverage," Claire corrected coldly. "But I didn't stop there. While you were busy focusing on a landscape architect, I was looking into the shell company you used to buy out the stone quarry and revoke his permits." Claire tossed a thick black folder onto the table right in front of Arthur. "That is a paper trail proving Vanguard Holdings illegally bribed city zoning officials to revoke Andrew's permits. It also contains evidence of wire fraud regarding your quarry purchase. I've already forwarded it to the SEC and the FBI." The boardroom erupted into chaos. The board members who had sided with Arthur suddenly began scooting their chairs away from him as if he were radioactive. "You're done, Arthur," Claire whispered, leaning down so only he could hear. "You tried to touch my family. I am going to dismantle your company brick by brick, and I am going to salt the earth where it stood." Arthur Pendleton opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was completely, utterly destroyed. An hour later, Claire walked out of the Zenith Tower. The rain was pouring down in sheets, washing the smog from the Chicago streets. She didn't call her driver. She hailed a yellow cab, giving the driver Andrew's address. When she arrived in the suburbs, she didn't bother with an umbrella. She walked up the cracked driveway in her soaked crimson suit, her hair plastered to her face, and knocked on the door. Andrew opened it. He looked exhausted, but his eyes widened when he saw her standing in the rain, looking stripped of all her billionaire armor. "It's done," Claire said, her voice shaking slightly from the cold. "Pendleton is facing federal indictment. Your permits are reinstated. Your suppliers will be begging for your business by tomorrow morning. He can never hurt you, or Chloe, ever again." Andrew stared at her. He had seen the news broadcast. He knew exactly what she had sacrificed. Her impenetrable privacy, her pristine corporate image, all to protect a man and a child she had barely known a month ago. You burned your own house down to save ours," Andrew said softly. "I don't care about the house," Claire said, the tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I just care about the people inside it. Andrew, please, let me come home." Andrew looked at the ruthless, brilliant, terrifying woman standing on his porch. He reached out, grabbing her hand, and pulled her out of the rain. The transition from a life of solitary, ruthless ambition to the chaotic warmth of a suburban family did not happen overnight. For the first 2 weeks, Claire Montgomery lived out of a suitcase in Andrew's small guest room. Outside the house, the world was on fire. The Diane Sawyer interview had detonated across the media landscape like a hydrogen bomb. News vans clogged the quiet suburban street. Paparazzi hid in the neighbors' rhododendrons, and helicopters occasionally thumped overhead. Claire handled the media circus with the same terrifying efficiency she used in corporate mergers. She deployed a private security firm, staffed by former Secret Service agents, to establish an ironclad perimeter around the property. When a photographer managed to sneak into the backyard to snap a picture of Chloe playing, Claire didn't just have him arrested for trespassing. She bought the tabloid that employed him and fired the editor-in-chief by 9 a.m. the next morning. The message to the press was clear: "Look at us, and I will end you." But inside the house, Claire was stripped of her armor. She was navigating a world where billion-dollar bank accounts meant nothing. It happened on a Thursday night. The fragile peace they had been building was shattered by the sound of Andrew shouting from Chloe's bedroom at 2 a.m. Claire bolted out of bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, and rushed down the hall. Andrew was sitting on the edge of Chloe's bed, his face pale, clutching a digital thermometer. Chloe was thrashing in her sleep. Her small face flushed a deep, terrifying crimson, her breathing ragged and shallow. 1042, Andrew gasped, looking up at Claire, with eyes wide with raw, unfiltered trauma. It was the exact look he had worn during the darkest days of Chloe's cancer battle. "Her fever is spiking. She's burning up. Claire, her immune system, if the marrow is rejecting." "Get your keys," Claire commanded, the pitch of her voice dropping to that steady, authoritative tone that anchored people in a crisis. She stripped the heavy blankets off the little girl, scooped Chloe's burning body into her arms, and ran for the front door. They didn't wait for an ambulance. Andrew drove his beat-up truck like a madman through the empty Chicago streets, breaking every speed limit until they screeched into the emergency bay of the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital. The moment they burst through the doors, Claire's corporate instincts flared. A triage nurse approached with a clipboard, asking standard questions. But Claire stepped forward, her eyes blazing. Her name is Chloe Hayes. She is a pediatric oncology and bone marrow transplant survivor. She has a fever of 104.2 and labored breathing. Page Dr. Jonathan Weaver, the head of pediatric immunology, immediately. Tell him Claire Montgomery is standing in his lobby, and if he isn't down here in 60 seconds, I will personally defund this entire wing. The nurse blanched, dropping the clipboard and rushing to the phones. Within minutes, Chloe was whisked into an isolation room, surrounded by specialists. Andrew paced the sterile hallway, his hands running frantically through his hair, muttering to himself. The ghosts of the past were suffocating him. He had lost Hannah in a hospital just like this. He couldn't lose Chloe. 2. Claire stood by the window, watching the doctors work on the little girl. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely powerless. She could buy real estate. She could manipulate the stock market. She could destroy rival CEOs. But she could not bribe a fever to break. She couldn't negotiate with a virus. Andrew sank to the floor, leaning against the cold wall, burying his face in his hands. A dry, agonizing sob tore from his throat. Claire turned away from the glass. She walked over, her expensive silk pajamas wrinkled and stained with Chloe's sweat, and sat down on the hard linoleum floor, right next to him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him everything would be okay. Instead, she wrapped her arms tightly around his trembling shoulders and pulled him into her chest, burying her face in his hair. "I'm here," she whispered, fiercely into the quiet, sterile hallway. "I am right here. Andrew, I'm not going anywhere." They sat on the floor for 4 agonizing hours. Just after dawn, Dr. Weaver stepped out of the room, pulling down his surgical mask. He looked exhausted, but offered a small, reassuring smile. "It's not the marrow," Dr. Weaver said softly. "It's a severe strain of a bacterial lung infection. Given her medical history, her body overreacted, causing the massive fever spike. We have her on broad-spectrum IV antibiotics. The fever is already broken. She's sleeping peacefully. She's going to be perfectly fine." Andrew let out a breath that sounded like his soul escaping his body. He scrambled to his feet and hugged the doctor before rushing into the room. Claire stayed behind for a moment, leaning against the wall, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. The terror she had felt, the sheer, blinding terror of losing that little girl, cemented a truth she could no longer ignore. Montgomery Global was just a company. Chloe was her heartbeat. 3 days later, Chloe was discharged, weak but smiling. The house felt like a sanctuary again, the air thick with profound relief. But the universe, it seemed, was not done testing the foundations of their unconventional family. On Sunday morning, a silver sedan, with Ohio license plates, pulled past the security checkpoint. Cleared, only because Andrew had authorized it. Martha Higgins, Hannah's mother, stepped out of the car. She was a stern, conservative woman in her late 60s, carrying a purse that looked heavy enough to be a weapon. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her jaw was set in a line of pure granite. Andrew had dreaded this moment. Martha had been a fierce, loving grandmother. But the Diane Sawyer interview had blindsided her. To discover on national television that Andrew had secretly tracked down the anonymous egg donor and was now living with her felt like a profound betrayal of her deceased daughter's memory. Claire was in the kitchen, cutting the crusts off a peanut butter sandwich for Chloe, when Martha stormed through the front door without knocking. "Where is she?" Martha demanded, her voice echoing in the small entryway. Andrew stepped out of the living room, holding up his hands peacefully. "Martha, Please, Chloe is resting in the other room. We need to talk quietly. Quietly. You want quiet after you humiliated my daughter's memory in front of 10 million viewers, Martha shouted, pushing past him and marching directly into the kitchen. Martha stopped dead, staring at Claire. The two women locked eyes. The grieving mother of the woman who had raised Chloe, and the biological mother who had given her life. The tension in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on. "Mrs. Higgins," Claire said calmly, setting down the knife. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you. I know this has been incredibly difficult." "Do not speak to me," Martha hissed, her voice dripping with venom. She turned to Andrew. "Have you lost your mind? You bring a stranger into this house, a billionaire who bought her way into your life. Hannah carried that child. Hannah suffered through the morning sickness, the labor, the sleepless nights. Hannah was her mother. This woman just signed a medical waiver for a paycheck." Claire flinched. The words hit her like physical blows, striking the deepest, darkest insecurity she harbored. She knew she hadn't been there for the hard parts. She knew she had essentially sold her genetics. "Martha, stop it," Andrew warned, stepping between them. "You don't know the whole story. You don't know what Claire sacrificed to protect us." "I know what she's doing," Martha cried, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "She's playing dress-up with my granddaughter. She has all the money in the world, and she decided she wanted a toy. And you let her. Andrew. Because she paid off your debts. Because she offers a life you could never give Hannah. I am going to call my lawyer. I will file for grandparents' rights. I will drag you through court before I let this corporate shark erase my daughter from Chloe's life." "Martha!" Andrew barked, his voice booming with a terrifying authority that silenced the older woman instantly. "Listen to me very carefully. No one is erasing Hannah. Hannah is the love of my life, and she is the reason Chloe knows how to love. But Hannah is gone. And when Chloe was dying of cancer, Hannah couldn't save her. I couldn't save her. Claire's genetics did. And when I brought Chloe to that boardroom by accident, Chloe was the one who called her Mommy." Martha stared at him, her chest heaving. "You think Claire is a shark?" Andrew asked, his voice softening, tears welling in his own eyes. 3 days ago, Chloe spiked a 104-degree fever. We thought the marrow was failing. Claire didn't call her assistants. She didn't write a check. She sat on the filthy floor of a hospital hallway for 4 hours, holding me while I cried, terrified out of her mind that she was going to lose her daughter. She is not replacing Hannah. She is helping me survive without her." Martha looked back at Claire. The billionaire CEO was standing by the counter, tears silently streaming down her face, making no move to wipe them away or defend herself. The Ice Queen was entirely broken, stripped bare by her love for the child sleeping in the next room. Before Martha could respond, the kitchen door squeaked open. Chloe stood there in her pajamas, clutching a piece of construction paper. She looked sleepily at her grandmother, then at Claire, sensing the heavy emotions in the room. "Nana?" Chloe murmured, walking over to Martha, dropped to her knees, sobbing openly, and pulled the little girl into a desperate hug. "Oh, my sweet girl, Nana's here. I'm so sorry." Chloe patted her grandmother's back gently. Then, she pulled away and handed the piece of paper to Martha. "I drew a picture for you, Nana." Martha took the paper with trembling hands. Drawn in bright, waxy crayons were 3 figures standing in front of a house. One was a tall man with brown hair. Next to him was a woman with dark hair and a bright green dress. But floating in the sky above them, drawn with yellow crayon to signify a glowing halo, was a woman with blonde hair, smiling down. "That's Mommy Hannah." Chloe pointed to the blonde angel. "She told me before she went to heaven that I should look for the other angel who helped make me. And I found her." Chloe turned and pointed at Claire. "Mommy Claire is the other angel." Martha stared at the drawing. The anger, the bitterness, the fierce protective grief that had driven her from Ohio suddenly melted away. She looked at Claire, really looked at her, and saw not a billionaire usurper, but a woman who loved the same little girl, just as fiercely as she did. Martha stood up, walked slowly over to Claire, and did the one thing Claire never expected. She wrapped her arms around the CEO, hugging her tight. "Take care of my girl," Martha whispered into Claire's shoulder, her voice breaking. "Take care of both of them." Claire closed her eyes, hugging the older woman back, a profound, healing relief washing over her. "I will, with my life." 6 months later, the boardroom of Montgomery Global was unusually quiet. The panoramic views of the Chicago skyline were as breathtaking as ever, but the atmosphere in the room was entirely different. Claire Montgomery stood at the head of the table. She wasn't wearing a severe, intimidating suit. She wore a soft, elegant cream dress, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She looked lighter, she looked happy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Claire said, her voice projecting with its usual confidence, though laced with a new warmth. "Over the last decade, we have built a monumental empire. But an empire is only as strong as its leadership, and right now, my focus is no longer on quarterly profits or global expansion. It is on my family. The board members, completely loyal to her after the destruction of Vanguard Holdings, watched in respectful silence. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO of Montgomery Global," Claire announced. A soft murmur rippled through the room, but no one argued. They had seen this coming. "I am appointing Marcus Thorne, our brilliant COO, as my successor. I will retain my seat on the board, but my day-to-day operations will shift to the newly established Hayes Montgomery Pediatric Foundation, focusing on funding bone marrow registries and supporting families devastated by medical debt." She signed the transition documents with a flourish, handed the gold pen to the new CEO, and walked out of the Zenith Tower for the last time as its ruler. She didn't feel a shred of regret. She felt completely, undeniably free. When her driver dropped her off, it wasn't at the cramped suburban house, nor was it at her sterile glass penthouse. It was at a stunning, historic stone manor in the leafy, quiet suburb of Evanston, nestled right on the edge of Lake Michigan. They had bought the house together. It was a compromise, spacious enough for Claire's need for breathing room, but warm, historic, and grounded enough for Andrew to feel at home. Claire walked around to the backyard. The transformation was breathtaking. Over the last 4 months, Andrew had poured his soul into landscaping the massive property. There were winding cobblestone paths, weeping willows, a beautiful koi pond, and a massive, sprawling flower garden that bloomed in vibrant shades of violet and gold. She found Andrew kneeling in the dirt, wearing a faded t-shirt and work boots, planting a row of hydrangeas. Chloe was beside him, wearing her signature yellow rain boots, aggressively digging a hole with a plastic trowel, her face covered in mud. "Mommy!" Chloe yelled, abandoning her hole and sprinting across the lawn. Claire dropped to her knees right in the dirt, ruining her designer dress, and caught the little girl, swinging her around until they both collapsed onto the grass, laughing. Andrew stood up, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm. He walked over, a slow, deep smile spreading across his handsome face. He looked at Claire, really taking in the sight of her, the former ice queen of Chicago, covered in mud, laughing hysterically with a 5-year-old on the lawn of the home they shared. "How did the board meeting go?" Andrew asked, extending a dirt-stained hand to help her up. "But they survived," Claire smiled, taking his hand and letting him pull her to her feet. She didn't let go of his hand. She stepped closer, looking up into his warm, brown eyes. "I'm officially unemployed, Mr. Hayes. What are you going to do with me?" "I think I can find some use for you," Andrew murmured, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against him. "The garden needs weeding, and Chloe insists on someone reading her the unabridged version of Peter Pan before bed." "I can handle that," Claire whispered, her breath ghosting across his lips. Andrew reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a massive, ostentatious diamond. He pulled out a simple, elegant vintage gold band with a single, deeply colored emerald that perfectly matched Claire's eyes. Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I don't have billions." "Claire," Andrew said softly, his voice trembling with raw emotion. "I don't have an empire to give you, but I have a home. I have a daughter who thinks you hung the moon, and I have a heart that, against all odds, belongs entirely to you. Will you marry me?" Claire looked at the man who had torn down her walls, who had fought through hell to find her, and who had given her a reason to finally stop running. "Yes," Claire choked out, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, Andrew. 1,000 times. Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and as he leaned in to kiss her, a loud, dramatic cheer erupted from the ground below them. "Finally!" Chloe yelled, throwing a handful of dirt into the air like confetti. Claire laughed against Andrew's lips. She pulled back, looking from the man she loved to the little girl who shared her eyes. A year ago, Claire Montgomery thought a boardroom was the only place she belonged, but standing in the mud, surrounded by the beautiful, messy chaos of a real family, the most powerful woman in Chicago finally realized what true wealth felt like. What started as a desperate father's mistake in a hostile boardroom turned into a beautiful, life-changing journey of healing, redemption, and a love that defied all the odds. Claire traded her cold, glass empire for the warmth of a family, and Andrew found the missing piece to his broken heart. If this emotional roller coaster of a story left you entirely speechless, you know what to do. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that miracles happen in the most unexpected places. And subscribe to our channel for more incredible, real-life stories. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite twist in Claire and Andrew's journey? See you in the next video.